I'm a convenience store clerk in Oslo, and last month an American family walked in asking where we kept the real Skittles. The mother held up a package from our candy section and said, "These can't be authentic. They're not bright enough." Her daughter agreed, claiming the colors looked washed out and fake. I explained these were manufactured by Mars for the European market. Identical product, just different ingredients. The mother laughed and told me European companies must be using cheap knockoff dyes to save money. She insisted the American version was superior because, and I'm quoting here, "The FDA has the strictest food standards in the world, so brighter colors mean higher quality control." She went on to explain that Europe probably couldn't afford the premium ingredients. I pulled up the ingredient lists on my phone. The American version contained yellow 5, yellow 6, and titanium dioxide, all banned here. The European version used natural colorings from fruit and vegetable extracts. She still didn't believe me, said I'd pulled up fake news websites. Her husband interrupted. Absolutely certain that the European Union banned American Skittles not for safety, but because they wanted to protect their own candy makers from competition. We'd read somewhere that trade. Protectionism was the real reason behind all European food bans. The whole family walked out convinced that Norwegian Skittles were counterfeit products, and that I was either ignorant or part of some conspiracy. I'm a pediatrician in Stockholm. And American parents visiting Sweden routinely question why I discourage certain snacks for their kids. One father brought his son in for a checkup and casually mentioned the boy ate Fruit Loops every morning. I suggested switching to less processed options. He stared at me like I'd suggested child neglect. He explained that Fruit Loops were pediatrician approved in America and fortified with essential vitamins. I clarified that the European version is heavily restricted due to artificial dyes linked to hyperactivity. He cut me off, insisting European doctors were behind the times because European medical schools were apparently less rigorous. He said American food scientists had debunked those old myths about food dyes decades ago, citing absolutely nothing. When I mentioned the studies, he told me those were probably funded by organic food lobbyists, trying to scare people. Was genuinely insulted that I'd questioned his parenting choices based on European paranoia. A bakery owner in Amsterdam and an American tourist once demanded to know why our bread goes stale so fast. I explained we don't use potassium bromate or other dough conditioners common in American bread. She said that proved American bread was more advanced and made with better preservative technology. She insisted that bread staying soft for 2 weeks was a sign of superior baking science, not questionable additives. When I mentioned that potassium bromate is banned here as a suspected carcinogen, she said Europe was overreacting to trace amounts because we didn't understand modern food chemistry. She claimed American bread lasted longer because they figured out how to lock in freshness naturally, apparently unaware that bromated flour has been linked to cancer in multiple studies. She left convinced that European bakers were simply not as skilled at keeping bread fresh. I'm a grocery manager in Copenhagen, and an American couple spent 20 minutes interrogating me about why we label certain products with warnings about artificial colors. The husband kept insisting these were scare tactic labels invented by European bureaucrats to justify their jobs. I showed him the EU regulation requiring warnings on products containing yellow 5, yellow 6, and several other synthetic dyes, stating they may have an adverse effect on activity and attention in children. He laughed and said, this was Europe's version of those ridiculous California cancer warnings that are on everything. He insisted that America had studied these dyes way more thoroughly and found them completely safe. When I mentioned that the European Food Safety Authority reviewed thousands of studies before implementing the warnings, he cut me off. He explained that the EFSA was known for being anti-American and probably banned these ingredients to hurt U.S. food exports. His wife chimed in, absolutely convinced that the warnings existed because European parents are more paranoid and sue companies over nothing. She claimed American parents were tougher and didn't freak out over a little food coloring, left muttering about European overregulation. I'm a pharmacist in Berlin, and an American customer asked why we didn't stock certain American vitamin brands. I explained that many contained additives not approved for use here. She told me that was backwards because American supplements were the most regulated in the world. She insisted the FDA had stricter standards than any European agency. When I mentioned that the European Union requires pre-market safety approval for additives, while America allows self-certification through the GRAS loophole, she dismissed it. She said the GRAS system was proof of American efficiency because it trusted companies to police themselves, rather than creating wasteful government bureaucracy. She claimed that European regulations were socialist red tape designed to slow down innovation. She went on to explain that American companies would never poison their own customers because lawsuits would destroy them, as if legal liability was an adequate substitute for safety testing. She insisted that requiring government approval before using new chemicals was un-American, and showed that Europe didn't trust the free market. She left convinced that European pharmaceutical standards were inferior, precisely because they required more oversight. I'm a school cafeteria director in Brussels, and an American exchange student's parents demanded to know why we didn't serve normal cereal. It's like Lucky Charms or Frosted Flakes. The mother insisted these were wholesome breakfast foods that provided essential nutrients for growing children. I explained that cereals with certain synthetic dyes require warning labels here. We prefer to serve alternatives without those additives. She said this was depriving children of nutrition, and that European schools were pushing an agenda against processed foods. She insisted that American breakfast cereals were enriched with vitamins and minerals, making them healthier than European alternatives. When I pointed out that we could provide the same nutrients without artificial dyes linked to behavioral issues, she accused me of spreading anti-American propaganda. She claimed that studies linking food dyes to hyperactivity were debunked by American researchers. She had no sources, but was absolutely certain about this. Her husband added that Europe's obsession with natural foods was elitist and discriminated against working parents who didn't have time for fancy organic cooking. They filed a complaint with the school board, demanding we stock American cereals without discriminatory warning labels. A tour guide in Reykjavik and during a food tour, an American visitor asked why Icelandic grocery stores didn't sell Mountain Dew. I mentioned it's due to restrictions on brominated vegetable oil, which was used in the formula. He said that was insane because BVO was just a stabilizer to keep the flavor mixed. When I clarified that BVO is also used in flame retardants and has been linked to neurological issues, he dismissed it entirely. He insisted that the dose makes the poison and that trace amounts in soda were harmless. He explained that Americans had been drinking Mountain Dew for decades with no problems, as if the absence of immediate death proved safety. He claimed European countries banned it because they're jealous of American beverage innovation. He was genuinely convinced that Europe's ban on BVO was protectionism disguised as health policy, designed to help European beverage companies compete. When another tourist mentioned that PepsiCo had already removed BVO from Mountain Dew in the US after public pressure, he called that caving to health nuts and insisted the original formula was perfectly safe. I'm a restaurant owner in Vienna, and an American diner complained that our chicken schnitzel didn't taste right. She asked if we used proper American-style chicken. I explained our chicken is local, antibiotic-free, and raised without growth hormones. She said that explained why it was tough and flavorless compared to American chicken. She insisted that American chicken was superior because they used scientific farming methods that made the meat more tender. When I mentioned that chlorine-washed chicken is banned in the EU, she perked up. She claimed chlorine washing was innovative food safety technology that made American chicken the cleanest in the world. She couldn't understand why Europe would ban such an advanced sanitation process. Explained that the EU objects not to chlorine itself, but to the need for such heavy chemical treatment, suggesting poor hygiene standards earlier in production. She rejected this completely, insisting that chlorine washing was an extra safety step that Europe couldn't afford. She said European regulations were stuck in the past while American food science had advanced. She actually argued that refusing to chlorine-wash chicken was anti-science and ignoring modern sanitation technology. She left a negative review claiming our chicken was unprocessed and potentially dangerous. A dairy farmer in rural Ireland. And American tourists visiting our farm always ask why our milk tastes different. One family insisted it tasted watery and bland compared to American milk. The father asked if we diluted it to save money. I explained that EU regulations prohibit the use of recombinant bovine growth hormone in dairy cattle, which affects milk composition. He said that explained the inferior quality because American milk was enhanced with scientific hormones that made it creamier and more nutritious. He claimed RBGH was one of the greatest agricultural innovations and that Europe banned it due to fear of progress. When I mentioned that RBGH has been linked to increased mastitis, infections in cows, and potentially problematic hormone levels in milk, he waved it off. He insisted that American regulatory agencies had proven it safe and that any concerns were organic industry propaganda. He explained that hormones were natural anyway, so adding more was just optimizing nature. His wife agreed, saying European milk was less evolved because we refused to use modern farming techniques. They actually complained that Irish dairy farming was primitive for not using growth hormones. I'm a cafe manager in Lisbon, and an American regular asked why our coffee creamer ingredients looked so basic compared to her favorite American brand. She showed me a photo of Coffee Mate's label, pointing to the long ingredient list as proof of quality. I explained that Portuguese creamers generally don't contain partially hydrogenated oils, titanium dioxide, or artificial flavors, common in American products. She said this meant European creamers were less advanced and not as smooth. She insisted that titanium dioxide was essential for achieving the proper white color, and that without it, creamer looked unappetizing. When I mentioned that titanium dioxide was banned by the EFSA due to concerns about DNA damage, she laughed. She claimed that was impossible because it's also used in sunscreen and paint, so obviously it's safe for everything. She explained that Americans had been consuming it for years without turning into mutants, which she considered definitive proof of safety. She insisted that Europe's ban was politically motivated and had nothing to do with actual health risks. She left convinced that Portuguese coffee culture was inferior because we used outdated, boring creamers. I'm a butcher in Munich, and an American customer was horrified that we couldn't sell him American-style processed lunch meat. He wanted the kind that stays fresh for months. I explained that many American meat preservatives and processing methods aren't approved here. He insisted this proved European meat spoiled faster because we lacked proper preservation technology. He claimed American meat science was decades ahead because they'd figured out how to extend shelf life safely. When I explained that meat lasting months typically requires additives like propylpropyl or excessive sodium nitrites, both restricted here, he called that natural preservation. He was convinced that making meat last longer was always better, regardless of method. He said Americans had conquered food decay while Europeans were still dealing with spoilage like it's the Middle Ages. He insisted that shorter shelf life meant inferior quality, not fewer preservatives. He wanted to know why Europe refused to adopt common-sense food preservation methods that would reduce waste. The concept that fresh meat should spoil relatively quickly was alien to him. I'm a customs officer in Paris. An American tried to bring in a suitcase full of American snack foods for her daughter studying abroad. When I confiscated items containing banned additives, she accused me of stealing legal products. She insisted that food approved by the FDA was internationally legal and that I had no authority to confiscate it. I explained that French law prohibits the import of foods containing certain banned substances. She said this was discrimination against American products and possibly a violation of international trade law. She demanded to speak to someone from the American embassy, convinced they'd overturn the confiscation. She kept insisting that EU bans on American food ingredients were illegal trade barriers, designed to protect European manufacturers. When I listed the specific banned ingredients, red 40, yellow 5, potassium bromide, said these were normal food components that Europe had unreasonably blacklisted, which claimed the bans violated WTO rules because they weren't based on real science. Left threatening to file a complaint with the U.S. State Department about France's protectionist food policies. A shipping coordinator in Rotterdam, and an American company tried to import breakfast cereal without declaring the artificial colors. When we rejected the shipment, their representative insisted this was a paperwork technicality. She claimed the dyes were standard food-grade ingredients that didn't need special declaration. I explained that products containing yellow 5, yellow 6, or red 40 require explicit labeling and warning statements in the EU. She said this was bureaucratic nonsense, invented to harass American exporters. She insisted that these dyes were the same chemicals Europe uses, just with different names, completely wrong. She claimed American companies were being unfairly targeted by European customs. When I showed her the EU regulation clearly stating the labeling requirements, she said it was designed to be so complicated that American companies couldn't comply. She accused the EU of creating hidden trade barriers disguised as safety rules. She was convinced that if American products simply used the European names for the same ingredients, they'd be approved. She couldn't grasp that the actual chemical compounds were banned. It's not just their nomenclature. I'm a translator in Geneva. I worked on translating American food labels for European compliance. An American manufacturer was shocked that we had to remove titanium dioxide from the ingredients and reformulate. The CEO insisted that titanium dioxide is titanium dioxide everywhere, and that it was chemically impossible for it to be unsafe in Europe, but safe in America. I explained that the EFSA had reviewed extensive research and concluded they couldn't rule out potential DNA damage. He said this was political science, not real science, and that European regulators were biased against American food technology. He claimed the ban was retaliation for American tariffs on European goods. He insisted that changing the formulation would make the product objectively worse because natural colorants don't provide the same visual impact, and I suggested that visual impact might be less important than safety. He said this proved Europeans don't understand marketing. He was certain that American formulations represented the pinnacle of food science, and that European alternatives were inferior substitutes. He left convinced that European food safety was theater rather than genuine health protection. I'm a food safety inspector in Stockholm, and during a routine inspection of an international school, I found American snacks in the cafeteria vending machine. The school administrator, an American expatriate, argued these were necessary because American students couldn't adjust to European snacks. She insisted that American dietary habits were culturally important and that forcing students to eat European alternatives was discriminatory. When I explained that several products contained banned additives, she said the bans were overblown and based on European hysteria about chemicals. She claimed that American students had constitutional rights to their native foods, even abroad. She insisted that exposure to small amounts of banned additives was harmless and that European regulations were excessive. She argued that the school should be exempt from local food laws because it served an American population. When I pointed out that location, not nationality, determines which laws apply, she called this cultural imperialism. She was genuinely convinced that American food standards should supersede local law on American serving institutions. The school had to remove the products, and she filed complaints about anti-American discrimination in food policy. I'm a health policy researcher in Amsterdam, and an American journalist interviewed me about EU food regulations. She kept trying to frame European bans as protectionism rather than public health measures. She asked why Europe targeted American brands specifically. I explained that the bans apply to ingredients, not brands European manufacturers reformulate for our market. American ones often don't. She insisted this proved the bans were designed to hurt American companies because compliance was too expensive. She claimed that if safety were the real concern, Europe would ban the ingredients universally, not just punish companies that didn't reformulate. I pointed out that's exactly what happens. Any company using banned ingredients faces the same restrictions. She said this was semantic games and that the real goal was economic protection. When I mentioned that Mars successfully reformulated Skittles for Europe, proving it's possible and profitable, she called that corporate surrender to political pressure. She left convinced that European food policy was trade war disguised as health concern, entirely missing that we simply Don't want DNA-damaging chemicals in children's candy. The American mind can't process that sometimes. A ban is just a ban, not trade protectionism. Not anti-American bias, not political theater, just different priorities about what belongs in food.